He always thought of himself as superior, mocking his pregnant wife for not having a job. But what he didn't know was that the next day, his life would take an unexpected turn. Chandeliers glittered overhead, casting golden light across the ballroom of the Fairmont estate. The annual financial sector gala was in full swing, with champagne flowing freely and laughter punctuating the soft jazz from the live quartet. In the center of it all stood Everett Montgomery, CEO of Montgomery Financial Partners, his tailored Armani suit a perfect complement to his winning smile. He held court in the middle of a circle of admirers, each hanging on his every word. And that's when I told the board, "Gentlemen, $7 billion simply isn't ambitious enough." Everett's voice carried across the room as his audience erupted in appreciative laughter. He raised his crystal flute in a mock toast, reveling in the attention. Across the room, Sydney Montgomery stood alone near a marble column, one hand resting protectively over her 7-month pregnant belly. Despite her designer maternity dress, a navy silk that complemented her auburn hair, she seemed almost invisible to the glittering crowd. Her eyes, however, missed nothing. They tracked her husband with laser focus, catching the way he positioned himself as the center of every conversation, the slight push of his chest whenever a competitor approached, the calculated warmth of his smile when speaking to potential investors. "Mrs. Montgomery, would you like to sit down?" A waiter approached with concern. "I could bring a chair over." "No, thank you." Sydney's voice was soft but not weak. "I prefer to stand." The waiter nodded and moved on, but the brief exchange caught Everett's attention. He excused himself from his admirers and strode purposefully toward his wife, glass in hand. The crowd parted for him like the sea before Moses. "Darling," he said, loudly enough for others to hear, "you look uncomfortable standing there all alone. Come join us." His words seemed considerate, but Sydney recognized the command beneath them. She allowed him to take her elbow and guide her toward his circle, feeling the firm pressure of his fingers. Not painful, but possessive. "Everyone," Everett announced. "My lovely wife, Sydney, carrying the future of Montgomery Financial." He patted her belly without asking permission, drawing smiles from the onlookers. "How wonderful," remarked Catherine Barnes, wife of a competing investment banker. "When are you due, dear?" Before Sydney could answer, Everett interjected, 2 months, and then back to work for me. I've been pulling double duty while this one rests." He squeezed Sydney's shoulder in what appeared to be an affectionate gesture, though she felt the subtle dig. "Actually," Sydney said quietly, "I've been reviewing quarterly projections from home. The Henderson acquisition looks promising, though the initial valuation seems inflated by about 12%. A brief flicker of annoyance crossed Everett's face before his smile reasserted itself. "Always trying to keep her hand in the business," he said with a chuckle. "But what Sydney really needs to focus on is preparing for our son." "We don't know it's a boy," Sydney corrected gently. "We decided to wait and see." "A father knows," Everett insisted, winking at the men in the circle. "Montgomery Financial needs a strong male heir." Sydney fell silent, her expression neutral, though her eyes darkened slightly. No one seemed to notice except for Marcus Chen, the firm's lead counsel, who watched the exchange with subtle interest. "Speaking of the business," Marcus interjected, "Sydney's revision of the Turner contract saved us from a potential 7-figure liability. Brilliant legal work." "Yes, well," Everett waved his hand dismissively, "Sydney has always had a good eye for detail, perfect for catching my occasional oversights." He turned to the group with a conspiratorial grin. "Behind every successful man, right, gentlemen?" The men nodded in agreement while Catherine Barnes gave Sydney a look of barely disguised pity. "Excuse me," Sydney said quietly. "I need some air." As she stepped away, Everett called after her. "Don't wander too far, darling. I'm about to tell them about the Brooks merger." Sydney paused at the French doors leading to the terrace, looking back at her husband. In that moment, something shifted in her eyes, a barely perceptible hardening, a decision crystallizing. She stepped outside into the cool April night, letting the door close behind her. The terrace overlooked Central Park, the city lights twinkling against the darkness. Sydney breathed deeply, one hand supporting her lower back, the other still resting on her belly. She felt a kick from within and smiled, a genuine expression so different from the polite mask she wore inside. "I know, little one," she whispered. "I'm tired of it too." "Mrs. Montgomery." Marcus Chen stepped onto the terrace, closing the door quietly behind him. "Are you all right?" Sydney composed her features. "Fine, thank you, Marcus. Just needed some fresh air." Marcus hesitated, then said, "You know, I've been meaning to talk to you about some of the overseas accounts. There are some irregularities I think you should be aware of." "What kind of irregularities?" Sydney's attention sharpened. "The kind that would interest the SEC," Marcus replied carefully. "But it's not a conversation for tonight. Perhaps we could meet next week." Sydney studied him, noting the concern in his eyes. "Tuesday morning? My house, around 10? Everett has meetings all day." Marcus nodded. "I'll be there." He turned to go, but paused. "Sydney, you're much more than just the woman behind the man. Some of us know that." After he left, Sydney remained on the terrace, the pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in her mind. She'd suspected for months that Everett was operating beyond the boundaries of legality, but confirmation from Marcus changed everything. Her hand tightened on the terrace railing. Inside, Everett's voice rose above the crowd as he launched into another self-aggrandizing story. Sydney watched through the glass as he mimed throwing papers across a boardroom table, his audience captivated. She knew the story. It was her strategy he was describing, her insight that had secured the deal. But in Everett's telling, she didn't exist. "Mrs. Montgomery?" Another waiter appeared with a glass of water. "Your husband asked me to check on you." Sydney accepted the water. "How thoughtful of him," she said, her tone betraying nothing. "Please tell him I'll be in shortly." As the waiter left, Sydney's gaze drifted to her reflection in the darkened window. 7 years of marriage to Everett had taught her patience and restraint. 7 years of watching him take credit for her work, of calculating smiles and strategic silences. 7 years of building Montgomery Financial from a modest firm to a powerhouse, all while Everett collected the accolades. A movement behind her reflection caught her attention. Everett was approaching, his smile fixed, but his eyes cold. "There you are," he said as he joined her. "You're being rude, Sydney. These people expect to see us together." "I needed a moment," she replied evenly. "You've had your moment." He took her elbow again, his grip firmer this time. "The Andersons are asking about you. They're considering a $10 million investment. Your job is to make them feel comfortable with me." "My job?" Sydney raised an eyebrow. "I thought I was supposed to be resting and preparing for our child." Everett's smile tightened. "Don't be difficult. You know how this works. You play the supportive wife, I close the deals. And who creates the investment strategies? Who structures the deals? Who ensures compliance?" Sydney's voice remained low, but there was a new edge to it. "I do," Everett said coldly, "with input from my team, which includes you. Don't forget your place, Sydney." Before she could respond, he guided her back inside, his public smile returning seamlessly. "Found her getting some fresh air," he announced to the waiting Andersons. "Sydney's always been one for dramatic exits, haven't you, dear?" "Not dramatic," Sydney corrected with a polite smile. "Strategic," Mrs. Anderson laughed. "I like her, Everett. She's got spirit." "Sometimes too much," Everett replied, his laugh not quite reaching his eyes. "Now about that investment opportunity." "Actually," Sydney interjected smoothly, "I was just telling Mr. Chen about a special structure for high net worth investors like yourselves. It offers significant tax advantages while maintaining liquidity." The Andersons turned to her with interest, and for a moment, Everett's mask slipped, revealing a flash of anger. Sydney continued outlining the investment vehicle, one she had designed but never shared with Everett, waiting for the right moment. "That sounds ideal," Mr. Anderson said, impressed. "Everett, you never mentioned this option." "It's still in development," Everett managed, shooting Sydney a warning look. "Sydney is getting ahead of herself." "Not at all," Sydney countered calmly. "The structure is ready. I can have the paperwork sent over tomorrow if you're interested." "We certainly are," Mrs. Anderson confirmed. As the conversation continued, Sydney felt Everett's fury radiating beside her, though his public demeanor never wavered. She knew there would be consequences later, but something had changed within her. The baby kicked again, as if in approval. The evening progressed, with Sydney remaining by Everett's side as expected. She played her role perfectly, the supportive, intelligent wife, while watching him grow increasingly agitated beneath his polished exterior. By the time they made their rounds of goodbyes, the tension between them was palpable, though invisible to most observers. In the back of their town car, Everett finally dropped his facade. "What the hell was that?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "You deliberately undermined me. I secured a $10 million investment, Sydney replied calmly. You should be thanking me. Don't play games, Sydney. You know how this works. I am the face of Montgomery Financial, not you. And yet, it was my investment vehicle that closed the deal. She met his gaze steadily. My work that will add to your reputation. Everett's jaw tightened. You're forgetting yourself. Everything you have, this car, our home, your comfortable life, exists because of me. I made you. Sydney looked out the window at the passing city lights, her reflection composed despite the turmoil within. No, Everett, you didn't make me. You've been taking credit for my work for years, but you didn't make me. This pregnancy has made you delusional, Everett scoffed. Maybe you should see Dr. Matthews again. Get something for your mood swings. Sydney didn't respond, but as they pulled up to their Upper East Side brownstone, she made a decision. The humiliation at the gala, the years of diminishment, Marcus's confirmation of her suspicions about the overseas accounts, it was enough, more than enough. As Everett strode ahead into the house, expecting her to follow as she always did, Sydney paused on the steps. She looked up at the home they shared, a monument to Everett's success, or so everyone believed. Coming? Everett called impatiently from the doorway. Yes, Sydney answered, her voice steady as she climbed the remaining steps. I'm coming. But as she crossed the threshold, her eyes were clear and focused. Everett Montgomery had no idea what was coming, but he would, soon enough. Tuesday morning arrived with a gentle spring rain tapping against the windows of the Montgomery brownstone. Sydney sat in the home office, technically Everett's though she used it more, arranging documents across the mahogany desk. The confrontation after the gala had played out as expected. Everett's cold fury, his dismissive comments, followed by his retreat to his study with a glass of scotch. The pattern was familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. The doorbell rang precisely at 10. Sydney straightened her blouse and made her way downstairs, one hand supporting her lower back. Good morning, Marcus, she said, opening the door to the legal counsel. Thank you for coming. Marcus Chen stepped inside, shaking rain from his umbrella. Unlike his usual polished courtroom appearance, he seemed tense, his normally immaculate tie slightly askew. I brought everything I could find, he said quietly, patting his briefcase as Sydney led him to the office. It's worse than I initially thought. Once seated, Marcus extracted a series of folders, spreading them across the desk. These are copies of wire transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands, Singapore and Switzerland, all technically legal on the surface, but when cross-referenced with these, he pulled out another stack of documents. The pattern becomes clear. Sydney leaned forward, studying the papers with focused intensity. He's been siphoning investors' funds and disguising it as operational expenses, Marcus confirmed. At least 40 million over the past 3 years. Sydney's expression remained composed, though her eyes hardened. Show me everything. For the next 2 hours, they pieced together Everett's elaborate scheme, falsified reports, manipulated investments, shell companies created solely to funnel money into his personal accounts. Why are you showing me this? Sydney finally asked, studying Marcus carefully. This could implicate the entire firm, including you. Marcus hesitated. Because I didn't join Montgomery Financial to become part of a criminal enterprise, and because, he paused, gathering his courage, because I've seen how he treats you, how he takes credit for your work. It isn't right. Sydney's gaze softened slightly. Thank you, Marcus. But exposing this would destroy everything we've built. Not everything, came a new voice from the doorway. Sydney looked up to see Rebecca Turner, the firm's head of research and analysis. Beside her stood David Kaplan, their chief technology officer. Sorry we're late, Rebecca said, stepping into the office. Traffic was terrible. Sydney raised an eyebrow. I don't recall inviting you. You didn't, David replied, closing the door behind them. Marcus did. We've been keeping our own records. Rebecca placed a thumb drive on the desk. Financial models that don't match the ones presented to clients, dating back 5 years. David added his own thumb drive. And emails. Lots of emails, including ones where Everett takes your analysis and presents it as his own. Sydney looked from one to the other, then back to Marcus. You've been working together. Behind Everett's back? Behind his back, but on your behalf, Rebecca said firmly. We've watched him build his reputation on your ideas for years. The Henderson acquisition, that was all you. The restructuring of the Asian investments, you again. The three of us started comparing notes about a year ago, Marcus explained. When we realized the extent of what was happening, both the credit theft and the financial improprieties, we knew we needed to build a case. Sydney sat back, absorbing this revelation. Why didn't you come to me sooner? Because we needed to be certain, David said, and because, he exchanged glances with the others, we weren't sure where your loyalties would lie. A shadow of a smile crossed Sydney's face. With my husband, you mean? It's complicated, Rebecca acknowledged. You're having his child, you've built a life together. Sydney's hand moved to her belly, feeling a kick from within. Her mind drifted back to 7 years earlier, to the day she'd first met Everett Montgomery. The investment conference buzzed with energy, young analysts and seasoned financiers mingling in the hotel's grand ballroom. Sydney Adams, fresh from completing her MBA at Wharton, navigated the crowd with purpose, her portfolio of innovative investment strategies tucked under her arm. "Excuse me," a confident voice interrupted as she studied the conference schedule. "You're in my light." Sydney looked up to see a handsome man in his mid-30s, impeccably dressed, with a smile that suggested he was used to getting his way. "I don't see your name on this particular patch of carpet," she replied, not moving. Instead of being offended, he laughed. "Everett Montgomery," he said, extending his hand. "And you are?" "Sydney Adams." "Well, Sydney Adams, how about I make it up to you with a drink?" She assessed him coolly. "I'm here to make connections, Mr. Montgomery. Professional ones." "As am I," he replied smoothly. "I'm building something significant. Montgomery Financial Partners. Perhaps you've heard of us?" She had, a promising boutique firm with a growing reputation. "I have." "Then you should know I'm always looking for talent." His eyes dropped to her portfolio. "What's that?" "My analysis of emerging markets in Southeast Asia. I believe they're significantly undervalued." "Bold claim," Everett said, his interest clearly piqued. "Show me." That evening stretched into dinner, where Sydney outlined her investment philosophy while Everett listened with growing fascination. Their intellectual chemistry was immediate and powerful. By dessert, he'd offered her a position. By the end of the month, they were dating. Within a year, Sydney Adams became Sydney Montgomery, bringing her brilliant financial mind into both his company and his home. "Sydney?" Marcus's voice pulled her back to the present. "Are you all right?" "Fine," she said, refocusing, just remembering how it all began. "Well, this is how it ends," Rebecca said firmly, gesturing to the evidence spread across the desk. "I have enough here to file SEC violations, possibly criminal charges." Sydney studied the documents, her mind calculating possibilities. That would destroy the firm. "The firm is already compromised," David pointed out. "Everett has seen to that." Sydney shook her head. "Montgomery Financial isn't just Everett, it's all of us. It's the legitimate investments, the client relationships we've built, and it's the future security of my child." She placed a protective hand on her belly. "There has to be another way." The four fell silent, contemplating alternatives. Finally, Sydney straightened, decision made. "Here's what we're going to do," she began, her voice taking on a new authority. "We're going to document everything, build an airtight case, but we're not going to the SEC, not yet." "Then what?" Marcus asked. "We're going to confront Everett, but on our terms. At the board meeting next month." David looked concerned. "That's weeks away. He could move more money, cover his tracks?" Sydney's smile was cold but confident. "He won't, because we're going to monitor every transaction. David, can you set up a system to track all financial movements without alerting him?" "Already have," David replied with a hint of pride. "I've been shadowing the accounting software for months." "Good. Rebecca, I need you to identify every client whose funds have been misappropriated. We need exact figures." Rebecca nodded. "I can do that." "And Marcus, I need you to prepare 2 sets of documents, one that outlines a path to legal consequences if Everett doesn't cooperate, and another that provides him a way to step down with some dignity intact." "You're offering him a way out?" Marcus asked, surprised. Sydney's expression turned pragmatic. "I'm offering the company a way forward. If this becomes a public scandal, everyone loses. Our clients, our employees, our reputations. This way, we control the narrative." The three exchanged glances, impressed by her strategic thinking. "What about you?" Rebecca asked. "What will you do?" "I'll handle Everett," Sydney said with quiet certainty. "I know how he thinks, how he reacts. I've been managing him for years without him realizing it. Over the following weeks, Sydney orchestrated her plan with meticulous precision. Each day she maintained her role as the supportive wife, attending functions on Everett's arm, reviewing documents he brought home, offering insights he would later claim as his own. But behind this facade, she worked with her secret allies, building their case and preparing for the confrontation. Late one night, as Sydney reviewed client records in the Home Office, Everett appeared in the doorway. "Still working?" he asked, leaning against the frame. "It's after midnight. Just finishing up," she replied, casually closing the folder containing evidence of his latest fund transfer. Everett approached, massaging her shoulders. "You've been different since the gala," he observed. "More engaged with the business." "Have I?" Sydney kept her voice neutral. "It's not necessary, you know. Everything's under control." His hands moved to her neck, his touch possessive. "You should be focusing on the baby." Sydney turned to face him. "I am." Something in her tone made Everett pause. "What does that mean?" "It means I want to secure his future." She met his gaze steadily. "Or hers." Everett laughed, tension broken. "Always the planner. That's what I admire about you, Sydney. You think ahead." He kissed the top of her head. "But trust me, I have everything under control. Montgomery Financial has never been stronger." As he left, Sydney allowed herself a small, cold smile. "Yes," she whispered to the empty room. "It will be." The following day, Sydney met with her allies at Rebecca's apartment, away from the prying eyes at the office. "We have confirmation on the Singapore accounts," Rebecca reported. "He moved another $2 million yesterday. And we have access to his private email server," David added. "He's been communicating with someone named Viper about moving funds offshore permanently." Marcus spread several documents across Rebecca's dining table. "I've prepared everything as you requested. The board meeting is in 3 days. Are we ready?" Sydney reviewed their evidence, each piece fitting perfectly into her plan. "Almost. There's one more thing we need." She turned to David. "Can you access Everett's schedule for tomorrow?" David nodded. "Of course. What are you looking for?" "His lunch appointment. I need to know who he's meeting." A few keystrokes later, David looked up, surprised. "Jackson Hayes, from the SEC." Sydney's expression darkened. "He's trying to get ahead of us. Probably buying influence." She thought for a moment. Change the reservation, different restaurant an hour later, and send Hayes an email from Everett's account apologizing for the change. "You want to intercept him," Marcus realized. "I want to turn him," Sydney corrected. "If Hayes is corrupt enough to meet with Everett secretly, he's corrupt enough to work with us instead, for the right incentive." The next day, as Everett attended his morning meetings, Sydney sat across from Jackson Hayes at Daniel, one of Manhattan's finest restaurants. "Mrs. Montgomery," Hayes said, clearly confused. "I was expecting your husband." "I know," Sydney replied calmly, "but I believe I can offer you something more valuable than whatever arrangement he was proposing." Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know what you're implying." Sydney slid a folder across the table. "Evidence of your 2 previous meetings with my husband. Payments totaling $75,000 to your offshore account. And documentation of your recent purchase of a vacation home in Aspen that your government salary couldn't possibly support." The color drained from Hayes's face. "Where did you get this?" "That's not important. What matters is what happens next." Sydney leaned forward. "In 3 days, Montgomery Financial will undergo a significant leadership change. You can either be implicated in Everett's downfall, or you can be seen as instrumental in helping facilitate a smooth transition. You're blackmailing me." "I'm offering you a choice," Sydney corrected. "The same one I'll be offering Everett." The board meeting was scheduled for Friday at 10 a.m. As Sydney dressed that morning, selecting a conservative maternity dress in deep blue, she felt the baby kick vigorously. "I know," she murmured, placing a hand on her belly. "Today everything changes." Everett emerged from the bathroom, adjusting his tie. "Ready for the quarterly update?" he asked, oblivious to what awaited him. "I think the board will be pleased with our performance." Sydney met his eyes in the mirror. "I'm sure it will be a memorable meeting." Everett smiled, mistaking her meaning. "With you by my side, how could it be anything else?" As they drove to the office in separate cars, Sydney insisting she might need to leave early due to a prenatal appointment, she made a final call to Marcus. "Is everything in place?" she asked. "Yes," he confirmed. "The board members have been discreetly informed to stay after Everett's presentation. Hayes is standing by. The security team has been instructed to ensure Everett doesn't leave the building during the meeting." "And the accounts?" Frozen as of 5 minutes ago, though he won't discover that until he tries to access them. Sydney exhaled slowly. Then it's time. As she ended the call, she caught sight of her reflection in the car window. The woman who stared back was not the same one who had stood silently at countless events while Everett took credit for her work. This woman's eyes held purpose, determination, and a cold sense of justice, long delayed. The Montgomery Financial headquarters loomed ahead, its glass facade gleaming in the morning sun. Sydney stepped out of her car, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the building with measured steps. The baby kicked again, as if in encouragement. "Don't worry," she whispered. "Mother knows exactly what she's doing." The Montgomery Financial boardroom exuded power and prestige, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan and a massive walnut table that seated the 12 board members. Framed accolades and financial publications featuring Everett's face lined the walls, visual testimony to his carefully constructed image. Sydney entered last, nodding subtly to Marcus, who sat with legal documents arranged before him. Rebecca and David were positioned strategically around the room, Rebecca beside the presentation screen and David near the door. The board members, mostly older men who had known Everett for years, greeted Sydney with polite smiles, still viewing her primarily as Everett's pregnant wife, despite her official role as Chief Strategy Officer. "Good morning, everyone," Everett began, standing at the head of the table with characteristic confidence. "Before we dive into the quarterly numbers, I'd like to highlight our exceptional performance in the Asian markets. Our strategic repositioning has yielded a 17% return, outperforming projections by nearly 5 points. Sydney watched him click through slides she had prepared, presenting her analysis as his own with practiced ease. A few board members glanced her way, perhaps noting the authorship markers still embedded in some of the slides, but no one commented. "The Henderson acquisition has been fully integrated," Everett continued, "resulting in operational efficiencies that have already improved our bottom line by $12 million this quarter alone." Sydney felt a momentary pang as she observed him, so confident, so completely unaware of what was coming. Despite everything, they had built a life together. For a brief moment, she wondered if there might have been another way. Then he said, "My vision for emerging markets has once again proven correct," and the moment passed. After 40 minutes of self-congratulatory presentation, Everett concluded with his trademark flourish. "Gentlemen, Montgomery Financial has never been stronger. Any questions?" The boardroom remained silent. Too silent. Everett glanced around, noticing for the first time the unusual tension in the room. "Well then," he said somewhat uncertainly, "I believe that concludes our quarterly update." "Actually, Everett," Sydney spoke up, her voice calm but firm, "we have one more item on the agenda today." Confusion flickered across his face. "I wasn't aware of any additional items." "That's because this item concerns you directly." Sydney rose from her seat, one hand supporting her lower back as she moved to the head of the table. "Marcus, would you distribute the documents, please?" Marcus began passing folders to each board member. Everett's confusion turned to irritation. "Sydney, what is this? We didn't discuss any additional presentations." "No, we didn't," she agreed, meeting his gaze steadily, "because you wouldn't have approved this one." As the board members opened their folders, a heavy silence fell over the room. Pages turned with soft, damning whispers. "What the hell is this?" demanded Walter Grayson, the longest-serving board member, looking up from the documents with shock. "Evidence of systematic fraud," Sydney answered evenly. "Misappropriation of client funds, falsified investment returns, and illegal offshore accounts." Everett's face drained of color. "This is absurd. Sydney, I don't know what game you're playing, but—" "It's not a game," she interrupted, nodding to David, who activated the main screen. Detailed financial records appeared, highlighting transactions between Montgomery Financial accounts and shell companies in the Cayman Islands. "These are wire transfers authorized by you personally, Everett. $47 million moved to accounts only you control." Everett's eyes darted around the room, finding no allies. This is a misunderstanding. These are legitimate operational accounts." "They're not," Marcus interjected, standing now. "I've verified the legal status of each entity. They exist solely to funnel investor funds into your personal accounts." "You're working with her?" Everett's voice rose in disbelief. "Marcus, I brought you into this firm." "Actually," Sydney said quietly, "I recommended Marcus after reviewing his work at Sullivan & Pierce. just as I identified the Henderson opportunity and developed the Asian market strategy and created the investment vehicle that secured the Anderson account. The board members looked from Sydney to Everett, decades of assumptions being rewritten in real time. "Is this true?" asked Elizabeth Winters, the only female board member besides Sydney. Before Everett could respond, Rebecca stepped forward. "I've worked with both of them for 6 years. Sydney has been the architectural mind behind every major success this firm has claimed. I have documentation proving her authorship of strategies Everett has presented as his own." "This is ridiculous," Everett sputtered, his composure cracking. "Sydney is my wife. We collaborate. Of course her work reflects my vision and leadership." "Does your vision include defrauding our clients?" Sydney asked, her voice still measured despite the tension crackling through the room. "Because that's what these documents prove. You've been stealing from the very people who trust us with their financial futures." Everett slammed his hand on the table. "Enough. This meeting is over. We'll discuss this absurd charade privately." He moved toward the door, but David stood firmly in his way. "Security has been instructed not to let you leave the building, Mr. Montgomery." "You can't be serious," Everett hissed. "This is my company." "Actually," Marcus said, extracting another document, "Montgomery Financial is a publicly traded company with fiduciary responsibilities to its shareholders and clients. And as legal counsel, I'm obligated to report evidence of financial crimes." Everett's face contorted with rage. "You'll regret this. All of you." He turned to Sydney, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Especially you. Think about what you're doing to our family, to our child." Sydney didn't flinch. "I am thinking about our child. That's why I'm doing this." Walter Grayson cleared his throat. "I think we need to address the immediate implications. If these allegations are true—" "They are," Sydney confirmed. "And there's more. At this moment, Jackson Hayes from the SEC is waiting in the conference room next door. He's aware of the situation and prepared to discuss next steps." At the mention of Hayes, true fear flashed across Everett's face. Sydney knew why. Hayes had been Everett's inside man at the SEC, and his presence here meant the protection Everett had bought was now gone. "You've been planning this," Everett said, realization dawning. "For how long?" "Long enough," Sydney replied simply. The board erupted in urgent conversation. Elizabeth Winters took charge, her decades of corporate governance experience coming to the fore. "We need to act immediately to protect the firm and our clients. Everett, in light of these allegations, I move that you be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation." "Seconded," said another board member quickly. "This is insanity," Everett protested. "You can't remove me based on unsubstantiated accusations from my hormonal pregnant wife." The sexist dismissal hung in the air, doing him no favors with the increasingly alarmed board. "The evidence speaks for itself," Marcus noted, "and Mrs. Montgomery is not the only source. This investigation has involved multiple senior executives who have independently verified the documents before you." A vote was called. It was unanimous. Everett Montgomery was suspended from all duties at Montgomery Financial Partners, effective immediately. As security was called to escort him from the building, Everett turned to Sydney one last time. "You think you've won? This isn't over. Remember who I am, who I know. You'll never run this firm." Sydney met his gaze without emotion. "I already do, Everett. I always have." The boardroom fell silent as Everett was led away, his threats echoing down the hallway. In his absence, all eyes turned to Sydney. "What happens now?" asked Walter Grayson. Sydney moved calmly to Everett's vacated position at the head of the table. "Now we contain the damage. Our priority must be protecting our clients and their investments. Marcus has prepared a plan to isolate and secure the affected accounts." "And the legal ramifications?" Elizabeth Winters asked. "That depends," Sydney replied, nodding to an assistant who opened the door to admit Jackson Hayes. The SEC investigator entered with a grim expression. "Mrs. Montgomery, board members," he acknowledged, "this is an unprecedented situation." "But not an insurmountable one," Sydney countered. "You've reviewed our evidence and our proposed remediation plan." Hayes nodded reluctantly. "The Commission would prefer to avoid a public scandal that could destabilize market confidence. If Montgomery Financial can make restitution to affected clients and implement the governance changes outlined in your proposal, we may be able to resolve this without criminal charges." A collective exhale of relief swept through the room. "What about Everett?" someone asked. Mr. Montgomery will be barred from serving as an officer or director of any public company, Hayes stated flatly. His personal legal jeopardy depends on his cooperation with our investigation. As the discussion continued, Sydney felt the baby kick vigorously. She placed a hand on her belly, a small gesture of reassurance. The confrontation had been necessary but draining, and there was still much to do. After the meeting concluded, Sydney retreated to her office. Not Everett's grander corner suite, but her own more modest space where the real work of Montgomery Financial had always been done. Rebecca, David, and Marcus followed, closing the door behind them. That went as well as could be expected, Marcus said, loosening his tie. The board is in shock, Rebecca observed, but they're rallying. Elizabeth Winters is already talking about appointing you as interim CEO. Sydney shook her head. That's not the plan. The three exchanged puzzled glances. But I thought, David began. Taking over Montgomery Financial was never my end goal, Sydney explained, easing herself into her chair. It's just the first phase. First phase of what? Marcus asked cautiously. Sydney's expression hardened slightly. Justice. Real justice. Not just for me, but for everyone Everett has stepped on, stolen from, or deceived. She turned to her computer, pulling up a document none of them had seen before. This is a list of every client whose funds were misappropriated, every employee whose ideas were stolen, every partner who was cheated in deals. You want to make restitution, Rebecca realized. Beyond what the SEC requires. I want to rebuild what Everett corrupted, Sydney corrected, and I want him to witness it all. His reputation, his connections, his influence, they'll crumble piece by piece while I transform his tainted legacy into something honorable. The three stared at her with new understanding. This wasn't merely a corporate coup or an act of personal revenge. Sydney's vision was far more comprehensive and perhaps more merciless than any of them had imagined. The divorce papers are already prepared, Sydney continued calmly. They'll be served to him this afternoon. The prenuptial agreement is void due to his criminal activities. Marcus confirmed that last week. You've thought of everything, David said, impressed and slightly unnerved. Not everything, Sydney admitted. Everett won't go quietly. He has resources we don't know about, connections we can't track. He'll fight back, and it will get ugly. We'll be ready, Marcus assured her. Sydney nodded, then winced slightly as the baby delivered a particularly strong kick. Are you all right? Rebecca asked with concern. Fine, Sydney replied with a small smile. Just a reminder of what's truly at stake. As her allies departed to implement the next stages of her plan, Sydney remained at her desk, staring at the ultrasound image framed beside her computer. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was she doing the right thing? Would her child understand why she had chosen this path? Her phone buzzed with a text from Everett. You'll regret this. I promise. The doubt vanished, replaced by cold resolve. There would be no turning back now. The board was calling an emergency press conference for 5 p.m. to announce Everett's leave of absence and the appointment of an interim leadership team. By tomorrow, rumors would be swirling throughout the financial district. By next week, Everett's carefully constructed reputation would be in tatters. Sydney placed a protective hand over her belly. I won't regret protecting you, she whispered, and neither will your father, once he understands what true accountability means. Outside her office, the firm hummed with urgent activity as the news spread. Sydney could hear hushed conversations, shocked exclamations, phones ringing constantly. The empire Everett had claimed as his creation was undergoing a seismic shift, and at the center of it all was the woman he had underestimated for 7 long years. A knock at her door announced Elizabeth Winters. The senior board member entered without waiting for a response, her expression a mix of admiration and concern. The board is unanimous, she said without preamble. We want you to lead Montgomery Financial through this transition, not as interim CEO, but as the permanent one. Sydney regarded her thoughtfully. And if I have other plans? Elizabeth sat down across from her. Sydney, I've watched you work in Everett's shadow for years. I recognized your hand in our successes even when he took the credit. The firm needs your vision now more than ever. The firm needs transformation, Sydney countered. Are you and the board prepared for how painful that might be? We're prepared to follow your lead, Elizabeth replied firmly. Whatever it takes to save what's worth saving and discard what isn't. Sydney considered the offer, weighing it against her larger plan. Perhaps the CEO position could serve her purposes after all, provide the platform and authority she would need for what came next. "I accept," she said finally. "On one condition, complete transparency moving forward. No more shadows, no more secrets." Elizabeth nodded, clearly relieved. "Agreed. The press conference is in 3 hours. We'll announce your appointment then." After Elizabeth left, Sydney opened her desk drawer and removed a small worn notebook. Inside were years of observations, ideas and plans, her true record of Montgomery Financial's evolution. On the last page, she had written a single sentence months ago when she first suspected the extent of Everett's fraud. "The truth doesn't destroy what deserves to stand." She closed the notebook and placed it in her bag. Phase 1 was complete. Phase 2, the true reconstruction, would begin tomorrow. And somewhere across town, in whatever temporary refuge he had found, Everett Montgomery was about to discover that his wife's ambitions extended far beyond taking his company. She was coming for everything. The morning headlines said it all. Montgomery Financial appoints new CEO amid fraud investigation. Sydney's photograph, dignified, professional, visibly pregnant, appeared beside articles detailing the leadership transition at one of Wall Street's most respected firms. The carefully worded press release revealed just enough to satisfy public curiosity while protecting the company from market panic. What the headlines didn't show was Sydney at 5 a.m., bent over the toilet in her master bathroom, morning sickness combining with exhaustion and stress. As she splashed cold water on her face, Sydney caught her reflection. Dark circles under her eyes, complexion pale despite her composed exterior. "One day at a time," she whispered to herself, straightening her shoulders. By 7 a.m. she was seated at the dining table of her brownstone, now emptied of Everett's belongings. He had arrived with a moving crew while she was at the press conference, taking only personal items. The prenuptial agreement's violation had frozen most of their joint assets pending legal resolution. Sydney reviewed the day's agenda while sipping ginger tea. The transition team meeting at 8:30, client calls beginning at 10, lunch with key investors who needed reassurance, strategy session with the board at 3. Another prenatal appointment squeezed in at 5:30. Her doctor increasingly concerned about her blood pressure. Her phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. "You stole my life. I'll take yours apart piece by piece." Sydney didn't bother blocking the number. Better to see Everett's threats coming than be surprised by them. At Montgomery Financial, the atmosphere had transformed overnight. The security desk had Everett's photograph with instructions to deny entry. His name had been removed from the company directory. His corner office stood empty, waiting for the extensive renovations Sydney had ordered. Not out of vanity, but necessity. She needed to erase the psychological imprint of his domain. "Good morning, Mrs. Montgomery," said the receptionist as Sydney entered, her tone carrying new respect. "Good morning, Vanessa, and please, call me Sydney." The transition team meeting began precisely on schedule, with department heads gathered around the boardroom table, some nervous, others clearly relieved by the change in leadership. "Before we begin," Sydney announced, "I want to address the elephant in the room. Yes, Everett Montgomery is my husband. Yes, I was instrumental in exposing his financial improprieties. And yes, I am filing for divorce." She paused, allowing the information to settle. "My personal connection to this situation gives me unique insight into both the problems we face and the solutions we need. I expect your candor, your questions, and your commitment as we rebuild trust in Montgomery Financial." For 4 hours, they dissected the company's vulnerabilities and strengths. Sydney listened more than she spoke, noting who presented honest assessments versus those still positioning for advantage. By the meeting's end, she had identified her true allies and potential obstacles. "Final thoughts?" she asked, scanning the faces around the table. Thomas Blackwell, the aging head of institutional investments, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Mrs. Montgomery, Sydney, we're facing an unprecedented crisis. Clients are nervous, competitors are circling, and you're due to give birth in what, 6 weeks? 5? Sydney corrected calmly. "My point exactly. Is this really the right time for you to take on this role?" The room fell silent, tension palpable. Sydney met Blackwell's gaze directly. "Thomas, when have I ever given you reason to doubt my capabilities?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Never. But this is different, is it?" Sydney raised an eyebrow. For 7 years, I've structured our major deals, developed our investment strategies, and managed our key client relationships, often while Everett took public credit. The only difference now is that I'm doing it openly with proper authority. Rebecca interceded supportively. Sydney has already spoken with our top 15 clients. 14 have confirmed they're staying with us, and the 15th is meeting with her today. As for my pregnancy, Sydney continued, I've worked with HR to develop a comprehensive transition plan for my maternity leave. Rebecca will serve as acting CEO for those 6 weeks, with my full support and the board's approval. The challenge neutralized, Sydney adjourned the meeting and moved through her day with methodical precision, balancing crisis management with strategic planning. By mid-afternoon, the first major hurdle appeared. The Wall Street Journal published an article questioning the firm's stability, citing anonymous sources close to Everett. He's fighting back, Marcus observed, dropping the newspaper on Sydney's temporary desk in a mid-level conference room. We expected this, Sydney replied, scanning the article. Who is C. Wilson cited here? I don't recognize the byline. New financial reporter, Marcus said. Started 3 months ago. Sydney's eyes narrowed. Check his background. I suspect we'll find a connection to Everett. Within an hour, David confirmed her suspicion. The reporter had previously worked for a small publication funded by one of Everett's college friends. He's using his network, Sydney noted. Predictable but effective. Draft a response highlighting our client retention numbers and the governance improvements we're implementing. Facts, not defensiveness. As she navigated these external challenges, Sydney maintained her focus on internal transformation. She instituted daily transparency reports, created an ethics hotline for employees to report concerns, and personally reviewed the status of accounts that had been compromised by Everett's activities. By week's end, exhaustion was taking its toll. At her doctor's appointment, the obstetrician frowned at her blood pressure reading. Sydney, you need to reduce your stress levels immediately. Your blood pressure is dangerously high. I'm managing a corporate crisis, doctor. Stress reduction isn't exactly an option. The doctor removed her glasses, expression serious. Then you need to consider bed rest for the remainder of your pregnancy. I'm concerned about preeclampsia. Sydney felt a chill of fear. That's not possible, not now. Your baby doesn't care about your corporate responsibilities, the doctor said bluntly. If you don't slow down, you're risking both your health and your child's. This medical warning coincided with Everett's first serious countermove. The following morning, Sydney received an urgent call from Marcus. Everett's legal team has filed for an emergency injunction, he reported grimly. They're claiming you manipulated evidence and coerced witnesses as part of a vindictive scheme to take control of the company. Sydney pressed her fingers to her temples, fighting a stress headache. The evidence stands on its own. They can't possibly... They've convinced Judge Hamilton to hear the case. He's a golfing buddy of Everett's father. The realization that Everett could potentially delay or derail the legal proceedings sent Sydney's carefully managed stress spiraling. Back at her brownstone that evening, alone in the expansive space that had once been their shared home, she finally allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. Sinking onto the edge of her bed, Sydney let the tears come. Tears of frustration, exhaustion, and worry for her child. For 7 minutes she permitted herself this private breakdown. Then, with deliberate calm, she wiped her eyes, picked up her phone, and called Elizabeth Winters. I need a favor, she said without preamble. A significant one. 2 days later, Sydney appeared in Judge Hamilton's courtroom, composed despite her doctor's warnings. Everett sat on the opposite side with his legal team, his once impeccable appearance showing signs of strain, stubble darkening his jaw, his suit slightly rumpled. Their eyes met briefly across the room, his burning with hatred, hers cool and determined. Before proceedings began, Elizabeth Winters entered with a silver-haired man Sydney recognized as Senator James Winters, Elizabeth's husband and a senior member of the Senate Banking Committee. The senator nodded politely to the judge before taking a seat directly behind Sydney. The message was unmistakable. This case had high-level attention. Judge Hamilton's expression soured as he realized his chamber had become politically charged territory. After brief arguments from both sides, the judge denied the emergency injunction, citing insufficient evidence of procedural impropriety. Everett stormed out without looking back, but Sydney caught his attorney's whispered warning. This is just the first round. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing. Sydney's prepared statement was brief and pointed. Montgomery Financial remains focused on serving our clients with integrity and transparency. The court's decision today affirms our path forward. As her car pulled away from the media frenzy, Sydney finally allowed herself to exhale. "Thank you," she said to Elizabeth, who had accompanied her throughout. "I won't forget this." "Don't thank me yet," Elizabeth replied soberly. "Everett still has resources and connections, and frankly, Sydney, you look terrible. Are you taking care of yourself?" Sydney managed a tired smile. "I'm trying. It's complicated." "It's not complicated," Elizabeth countered firmly. "It's necessary. This company needs you healthy and clear-headed. Your baby needs you even more." That evening, Sydney made a difficult decision. She called Rebecca, David, and Marcus to her home and outlined a modified leadership plan. "I'm taking a step back from day-to-day operations," she announced. "Not completely, but enough to safeguard my health and my pregnancy. Rebecca will handle internal management. David, you'll oversee our technology transition and security protocols. Marcus, you'll continue managing legal affairs and the SEC negotiations." "And you?" Rebecca asked, concerned. "I'll focus on client relationships and strategic direction, things I can manage with limited hours and lower stress. My doctor is insisting on partial bed rest for the remainder of my pregnancy." The three exchanged worried glances. "Is everything okay with the baby?" David asked. Sydney hesitated, then decided on honesty. "There are concerns about my blood pressure and potential complications. Nothing definitive, but enough to warrant caution." "Then that settles it," Marcus said firmly. "We'll handle everything else. You focus on staying healthy." For the next 3 weeks, Sydney operated from a makeshift office in her bedroom, conducting video conferences and reviewing documents while following her doctor's orders for rest. Her reduced presence at Montgomery Financial created space for her leadership team to step up, proving more capable than even she had anticipated. Meanwhile, Everett's situation deteriorated. The SEC investigation expanded to include his personal finances. Former associates distanced themselves. His membership at the Metropolitan Club, a bastion of old money influence, was quietly suspended. His response was a campaign of increasingly desperate measures. Anonymous tips to financial reporters, suggesting Sydney was hiding health problems that made her unfit to lead. Attempts to contact key clients directly, offering to bring their accounts to a new venture he was forming. A leak to Page 6 about an alleged affair Sydney had conducted early in their marriage, entirely fabricated, but damaging nonetheless. Sydney weathered these attacks with outward composure, though each took its toll. The stress management techniques her doctor recommended, meditation, gentle yoga, controlled breathing, provided limited relief. What sustained her was the growing evidence that Montgomery Financial was not just surviving, but strengthening under the new leadership structure. Then, at 37 weeks pregnant, Sydney's water broke during a video conference with Asian investors. "Excuse me?" she said with remarkable calm, "but I need to end this call. My baby has decided today is the day." The birth was difficult. After 16 hours of labor, Sydney's blood pressure spiked dangerously, forcing an emergency C-section. When she finally regained full consciousness, a nurse placed a tiny bundle in her arms. "Your daughter," the nurse said softly. 5 pounds, 7 ounces, small but strong. Sydney gazed down at the infant's face. Perfect, delicate, with a determined set to her tiny mouth that made Sydney smile despite her exhaustion. "Hello, Sophia," she whispered, the name she and Everett had once chosen together now belonging to a future he had forfeited. "We made it." As mother and daughter recovered in the hospital, Sydney received a stream of visitors. Rebecca, David, Marcus, Elizabeth, and other allies who had become something more than colleagues during the crisis. Conspicuously absent was Everett, though he had been notified of his daughter's birth as a legal courtesy. On their 3rd day in the hospital, as Sydney was preparing for discharge, a delivery arrived, an extravagant arrangement of roses with a card that read simply, "This isn't over. E." Sydney calmly handed the card to Marcus. "Add it to the file," she said, unmoved by the implied threat, "and donate the flowers to another patient." The following weeks transformed Sydney in ways the corporate battle had not. Nursing Sophia in the pre-dawn hours, watching her tiny fingers grasp and explore, experiencing the profound vulnerability and strength of new motherhood, these moments shifted her perspective subtly but significantly. When she finally returned to Montgomery Financial for a brief board meeting 6 weeks after Sophia's birth, Sydney carried herself differently. The hardness that had developed during her confrontation with Everett had softened, replaced by something more nuanced, yet equally powerful. "Welcome back," Elizabeth greeted her warmly. "You look wonderful." "I feel changed," Sydney admitted, "in ways I'm still understanding." The board meeting was largely ceremonial, approving Sydney's official return from maternity leave and recognizing the leadership team's achievements in her absence. Montgomery Financial had not merely survived, it had thrived. Client confidence had been restored. New governance procedures were earning industry recognition. The SEC investigation was proceeding cooperatively with minimal public impact. As Sydney concluded her remarks, Walter Grayson raised an unexpected question. "What about the company name? Will we continue as Montgomery Financial Partners?" A thoughtful silence fell over the room. The name represented both the firm's established reputation and its compromised past. For now, yes, Sydney decided. A name change might appear as though we're hiding rather than transforming. But ask me again in a year. The meeting adjourned on this note of cautious optimism. Sydney collected her things, eager to return home to Sophia and her nanny, when her assistant handed her an envelope that had just been delivered. "It passed security screening," the assistant assured her. "But given the sender, I thought you should know right away." The envelope bore Everett's handwriting. Sydney opened it carefully, extracting a single sheet of paper, not a threat this time, but a request for a meeting. "I want to see my daughter," he had written. "Name your terms." Sydney folded the note deliberately, tucking it into her portfolio. This moment, Everett's first acknowledgement of Sophia as more than a pawn in their conflict, marked a potential turning point. How she responded would shape not just the next phase of their battle, but the future she was building for her daughter. As Sydney left the Montgomery Financial building, the October sun cast long shadows across Wall Street. She had survived Everett's initial counterattacks. She had given birth to a healthy daughter. She had guided the company through its darkest hours. Yet standing at the threshold of this new chapter, Sydney sensed that the true test still lay ahead. Everett was regrouping, adapting his strategy. His request to see Sophia wasn't about fatherly love. It was his way of identifying her new vulnerability. And despite everything, Sydney found herself wondering if reconciliation in some form might still be possible. This moment of uncertainty, this willingness to consider paths beyond revenge, would prove to be either her greatest strength or her fatal weakness. Only time would tell. The neutral ground Sydney selected for their meeting was a private room at the Pierre Hotel, arranged through Elizabeth's connections to ensure absolute discretion. Sydney arrived first, instructing the nanny to wait with Sophia in an adjoining suite. She wanted to speak with Everett alone before determining whether he would see their daughter. When Everett entered, Sydney barely recognized him. Gone was the immaculate appearance and commanding presence that had defined him on Wall Street. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, his face gaunt with dark circles beneath bloodshot eyes. Yet despite his physical deterioration, his gaze retained its calculating intensity. "Sydney," he acknowledged, remaining standing despite the comfortable seating arrangement. "You look well. Motherhood agrees with you." "Thank you for coming," she replied neutrally. "Please sit." He lowered himself into a chair across from her, his movement stiff as though physical comfort might signal weakness. "Where is she?" "Nearby. We have things to discuss first." Everett's jaw tightened. "She's my daughter too. I have rights." "Rights you've shown no interest in exercising until now," Sydney observed. "It's been 3 months since her birth, Everett. This is your first inquiry about her welfare." "I've been somewhat preoccupied," he retorted with bitter sarcasm. "Dealing with the systematic destruction of my life's work." Sydney met his gaze steadily. "Your choices destroyed what you built. I simply exposed them." For a moment, raw hatred flashed across his features before he mastered himself. "I didn't come here to rehash the past. I want to see my daughter." "Why now?" Sydney pressed. "What's changed?" Everett hesitated, an uncharacteristic vulnerability briefly crossing his face. "Maybe I've had time to reflect. Maybe I want something in my life that isn't tainted by everything else." The sincerity seemed genuine, but Sydney had long ago learned to distrust Everett's performances. "And it has nothing to do with the Spencer Group's interest in acquiring Montgomery Financial." Surprise flickered in his eyes before he could hide it. "How did you—" They approached the board yesterday, Sydney explained, quite generously considering our recent troubles. But then their CEO was your roommate at Yale, wasn't he? The pieces connected instantly. The Spencer Group, led by Everett's old friend, would acquire Montgomery Financial at a bargain price, then reinstall Everett in a leadership position once the legal dust settled. A backdoor return to power. You've always been too clever for your own good, Everett said, his momentary vulnerability vanishing. Fine. Yes. I advised William on the potential acquisition. It's good business. Nothing more. And your sudden interest in Sophia? Is that good business too? Everett leaned forward, his voice hardening. Don't use our daughter against me. Whatever you think of me, I have a right to know her. You have a legal right, Sydney corrected. Moral rights are earned, Everett. Before he could respond, Sydney's phone vibrated with a text from Marcus. Wheeler confirmed. Wire trail leads to Jakarta account. Sending details now. A small, cold smile touched her lips as she read the message. The final piece had fallen into place. Is something amusing? Everett asked sharply. Not amusing, Sydney replied, setting down her phone. Enlightening. Tell me, how is James Wheeler these days? Everett stiffened at the name of his former Harvard classmate, who now headed a private equity firm in Singapore. I wouldn't know, we're not in regular contact. That's strange because he's been quite busy on your behalf. Sydney opened her portfolio and extracted several documents. 3 weeks ago, Wheeler's firm acquired a controlling interest in Meridian Publishing, which owns the financial blog that's been publishing hit pieces about Montgomery Financial. 2 weeks ago, he purchased a substantial block of our stock through shell companies. And yesterday, she slid a bank statement across the table. He transferred $5 million to an account you control in Jakarta. Everett's expression remained impassive, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. You've been monitoring my personal finances. That's illegal. Not when it's part of an SEC investigation you're already subject to. Sydney leaned forward. Did you really think I wouldn't anticipate your moves? That I wouldn't protect what I've built? What we built? Everett corrected sharply. Don't rewrite history, Sydney. Whatever my mistakes, Montgomery Financial exists because of my vision, my connections. Your connections, Sydney agreed. My strategies. Your charm. My substance. It was always a partnership, Everett, one you never acknowledged. A heavy silence fell between them. Outside, rain began to patter against the windows, the sky darkening with an approaching storm. What do you want? Everett finally asked, his voice lower. To destroy me completely? To ensure I never work in finance again, to keep me from my child? Just tell me your price. Sydney studied him, searching for genuine remorse, but finding only calculation. There's no price, Everett. This isn't a negotiation. Everything's a negotiation, he countered. You've proven your point. You've shown the world who really built Montgomery Financial. You've secured your position and your legacy. Isn't that enough? You still don't understand, Sydney said with something approaching pity. This was never about taking your place or proving my worth. It was about accountability. Everett's facade finally cracked, frustration breaking through. For God's sake, Sydney, what more do you want from me? I've lost everything, my company, my reputation, most of my assets. The SEC is freezing my remaining accounts. I'm facing possible criminal charges. I'm staying in a furnished apartment because I can't even get a lease in my own name anymore. Is this really about accountability, or is it about revenge? The raw emotion in his outburst gave Sydney pause. For the first time, she glimpsed the true extent of his fall, not just professionally but personally. The golden boy of Wall Street reduced to a pariah, watching his carefully constructed world disintegrate completely. It was never about revenge, she said quietly, but I won't apologize for holding you accountable for your actions. My actions? Everett laughed bitterly. You make it sound so simple, as if I woke up one morning and decided to commit fraud. You know how this business works, Sydney. Everyone operates in gray areas. Everyone pushes boundaries. I just pushed too far. Don't minimize what you did, Sydney countered sharply. You stole from clients who trusted you. You lied to investors. You built a financial house of cards and left others to suffer the consequences. And you've made me pay for it, he shot back. So what now? What happens to our daughter while you crucify me publicly? The mention of Sophia refocused the conversation. Sydney considered her next words carefully. I've made arrangements for visitation rights, she said finally. Supervised initially. If those go well, we can discuss expanding your access. Everett's expression darkened. Supervised? Like I'm some kind of criminal? You're under federal investigation for financial crimes, Sydney reminded him. These are standard precautions. Precautions, he repeated mockingly. Just admit it, Sydney. You want to control everything, the company, our daughter, my access to her. What I want is to protect her, Sydney said firmly. From your instability, from the media circus, and yes, from your influence, until you demonstrate that you can be a positive presence in her life. Everett stood abruptly, pacing to the window. For several minutes he stared out at the rain-slicked streets below, his reflection fragmented by the water running down the glass. When he finally turned back, his expression had changed, a dangerous calm replacing his earlier agitation. I have something you should see, he said, reaching into his jacket pocket and extracting a small flash drive. Before you make any final decisions about my role in our daughter's life. Sydney eyed the device suspiciously. What is this? Insurance, Everett replied cryptically. I'm not the only one with secrets, Sydney. With deliberate movements, he placed the drive on the coffee table between them. 6 years ago, when we were securing the Matsumoto deal in Tokyo, you met privately with Hideki Tanaka the night before the final negotiation. Sydney's heart skipped a beat, though she kept her expression neutral. That meeting was authorized. We discussed terms. I discussed more than terms, Everett said softly. I had the hotel suite wired. Standard practice for high-stakes negotiations, as you know. The implication hung in the air like a physical threat. Sydney had indeed met with Tanaka that night. The discussion had begun professionally, but evolved into something more personal. Not an affair, but a moment of emotional vulnerability during a rocky period in her marriage. She had confided things about Everett, about their relationship, about his business practices that, taken out of context, could be devastating. Are you blackmailing me? Sydney asked, her voice steady, despite the sudden churning in her stomach. I prefer to think of it as creating balance in our negotiations, Everett countered smoothly. This recording would interest not only the board, but also the SEC investigators. Your knowledge of certain inconsistencies in our business practices dates back much further than you've claimed. Sydney's mind raced, calculating implications and potential responses. You would hurt the mother of your child to save yourself. I would protect my relationship with my daughter by any means necessary, Everett corrected. Just as you would. The stakes had suddenly escalated beyond professional rivalry or marital dissolution. This was Everett's true countermove, not the Spencer Group acquisition scheme, which had clearly been a diversion, but this more personal attack. Sydney reached for the flash drive, turning it over in her hand. What do you want? A fresh start, Everett said immediately. Drop the personal vendetta. Use your influence with the SEC to limit the investigation to the company, not me individually. Joint custody of Sophia, unsupervised, and your public support for my new venture capital firm. You're delusional, Sydney replied, setting the drive down. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't call off the SEC. You have influence, Everett insisted. Elizabeth Winter's husband sits on the banking committee. You've cultivated relationships with the investigators. You could shape the outcome if you tried. Sydney stood, smoothing her skirt with deliberate calm. I'll need time to consider this. Of course, Everett agreed, the familiar confidence returning to his voice. Take 24 hours, but remember what's at stake. As if on cue, a baby's cry sounded faintly from the adjoining suite. Everett's head turned toward the sound, something genuine flickering in his eyes. Is that her? He asked, his voice softening. Sydney nodded. Would you like to meet her now? The question seemed to catch him off guard. After threatening Sydney with blackmail, he hadn't expected this offer. His momentary confusion revealed more vulnerability than he had shown throughout their entire conversation. Yes, he said simply. Sydney went to the connecting door and spoke quietly to the nanny, who appeared moments later carrying Sophia. The infant was alert, her dark eyes, so like her father's, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with apparent curiosity. Everett, this is your daughter, Sydney said, taking Sophia from the nanny. Sophia Grace Montgomery. She approached him slowly, watching as emotions chased across his face. Wonder, fear, a flash of genuine tenderness. When she carefully transferred the baby to his arms, his hands trembled slightly. Hello, Sophia, he whispered, studying her tiny features. I'm your father. For several minutes, the battle between them receded as they both focused on their daughter. Sophia regarded Everett with solemn interest, eventually grasping his finger in her tiny hand. The gesture seemed to pierce something in him. When he looked up at Sydney, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "She's perfect," he said hoarsely. "Yes," Sydney agreed, "and she deserves better than what either of us has been giving her." The simplicity of this truth hung between them, momentarily transcending their conflict. Then Sophia began to fuss, and Sydney took her back, soothing her with practiced ease. "I should go," Everett said, visibly pulling himself together. 24 hours, Sydney. Then I need your answer." After he left, Sydney sat with Sophia cradled against her chest, the flash drive on the table before her like a live grenade. The choice she faced was impossible: capitulate to blackmail and allow Everett to escape true accountability, or risk a scandal that could harm both Montgomery Financial and ultimately Sophia's future. Back at home, while Sophia napped, Sydney inserted the drive into her secure laptop. The recording was exactly as Everett had described: her late-night conversation with Tanaka, including damning comments about Everett's business practices. Comments that, while not confessing knowledge of outright fraud, certainly suggested she had been aware of ethical grey areas far earlier than she had admitted. Sydney closed the laptop and paced her living room, weighing options and outcomes. By midnight, her decision was made. She placed a call to Marcus. "I need everything we have on Hideki Tanaka," she instructed, "and contact Elizabeth. I need an emergency meeting with her husband tomorrow morning." The following day dawned clear and cold. Sydney arrived at the Capitol Hill office of Senator Winters precisely at 8 a.m., Sophia with her nanny waiting in a nearby coffee shop. "This is unexpected," the senator greeted her, gesturing to a seat across from his imposing desk. "Elizabeth said it was urgent." "It is," Sydney confirmed. "I need your guidance on a sensitive matter involving the SEC investigation." For 30 minutes, she outlined the situation in clinical detail, including the blackmail attempt and the contents of the recording. The senator listened without interruption, his expression grave. "This puts us all in a difficult position," he said finally. "If this recording becomes public, it could compromise the entire case against Everett." "I know," Sydney acknowledged. "That's why I need options." The senator leaned back, considering. "There are 3 paths forward as I see it. 1, you acquiesce to his demands, which sets a dangerous precedent and allows a financial criminal to potentially harm others in the future. 2, you call his bluff, risking your reputation and potentially the case against him. Or 3, he paused significantly. "Or 3, Sydney prompted. "You flip the script. Take control of the narrative before he can." By noon, Sydney's plan was in motion. By 3, all pieces were in place. At exactly 4 o'clock, she arrived at Everett's temporary apartment in Battery Park City, an address she had obtained through Marcus's connections. Everett opened the door with a triumphant smile that faltered when he saw her expression. "You're early," I said 24 hours. "Plans change," Sydney replied, stepping past him into the sparsely furnished apartment. "Nice place." "Temporary, I assume." "Until the situation stabilizes," he answered cautiously, closing the door. "Have you made your decision?" "I have." She turned to face him directly. "The answer is no." Everett's expression hardened. "Then you leave me no choice. By this time tomorrow, the recording will be in the hands of every board member, the SEC, and selected media outlets." "No, it won't," Sydney countered calmly. "Because 30 minutes ago I gave my full statement to the SEC, including details of our meeting yesterday, your blackmail attempt, and the contents of the recording. I've also filed a police report for extortion." Everett's face drained of color. "You're bluffing." "I also contacted Hideki Tanaka," Sydney continued as if he hadn't spoken. "He's provided a sworn statement that you approached him after our meeting in Tokyo, threatening to reveal personal information about his family unless he altered certain terms of the Matsumoto deal to facilitate your siphoning of funds. That matches perfectly with the timeline of when your offshore accounts began showing significant activity." Everett sank onto a bar stool at the kitchen counter, stunned into silence. "You made a critical error," Sydney said, her voice softening almost sympathetically. "You gave me 24 hours to respond. You should have known I'd use that time." "This is absurd," Everett managed finally. "It's your word against mine." "It's considerably more than that," Sydney corrected. "Senator Winters has opened a formal inquiry into your attempts to manipulate a federal investigation. The recording you thought would destroy me actually provides timeline evidence that helps the case against you. The realization of complete defeat washed over Everett's face. His shoulders slumped, the last vestiges of his once formidable presence collapsing. "Why are you really here?" he asked dully. "To witness my final humiliation." Sydney shook her head. "I'm here to offer you a choice. The real choice, not the false one you tried to force on me." She sat across from him, close enough to see the stubble on his unshaven face, the brokenness in his eyes. Option 1. Face the additional charges of extortion and witness tampering, which will almost certainly result in prison time. Option 2. Voluntary cooperation with the ongoing investigations, full disclosure of all remaining hidden assets, and acceptance of a lifetime ban from the securities industry. "And in return?" Everett asked hoarsely. "In return, I'll support a plea arrangement that focuses on financial penalties rather than incarceration. And," she paused, the most difficult part coming last, "I'll honor our agreement about supervised visitation with Sophia, with the potential for expanded access if you demonstrate genuine change." Everett stared at her, searching for deception. "Why would you do that? After everything?" "Not for you," Sydney said honestly. "For her. Sophia deserves the chance to know her father, the man you could be, not the man you've been." Outside, the winter sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sparse apartment. In that fading light, something shifted between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the first fragile tendril of understanding. "I'll need time to consider," Everett said finally. Sydney stood, gathering her coat. "You have until tomorrow morning. Unlike you, I mean what I say about deadlines." As she reached the door, Everett called after her. "Sydney." She turned back. "How did you know that I would use that recording against you?" A sad smile touched her lips. "Because it's what I would have done if I were still playing by your rules." She opened the door. "But I'm not. Not anymore." The next morning, Everett's lawyer contacted Marcus with his decision. He would cooperate fully, accepting the lifetime industry ban in exchange for avoiding prison time. The war between them was over, not with a dramatic confrontation or public humiliation, but with a quiet surrender. That evening, Sydney sat in her home office, Sophia sleeping peacefully in a bassinet beside her desk. On her computer screen was a draft press release announcing Montgomery Financial's formal name change to Horizon Partners, effective in the new year. The rebranding would mark the final step in the company's transformation, and in Sydney's own journey from shadow architect to recognized leader. As she made final edits to the announcement, Sydney reflected on the true nature of victory. It wasn't crushing Everett completely, as she had once imagined. It wasn't public vindication or even professional success. It was creating something sustainable from the ashes of what had been destroyed, a company with integrity, a future for her daughter, and perhaps most surprisingly, peace within herself. The baby stirred, making tiny noises that Sydney had already learned to recognize as the prelude to waking. She saved her work and turned away from the computer, ready to attend to the most important outcome of all their battles and betrayals, the innocent life they had created together. "I'm here, little one," she whispered, lifting Sophia into her arms, "and I always will be." Spring arrived in New York City with an explosion of cherry blossoms in Central Park. 18 months had passed since the confrontation in Everett's temporary apartment, 18 months of systematic transformation for both Montgomery Financial, now officially Horizon Partners, and for Sydney herself. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Sydney's redesigned office as she reviewed the quarterly projections. The space bore no resemblance to Everett's former domain. Gone were the dark woods and masculine hunting prints, replaced by clean lines, natural light, and a single striking painting, a commissioned work showing a woman architect reviewing blueprints, her face in profile reminiscent of Sydney's own. More practical changes included the addition of a small adjoining room where Sophia could play under the watchful eye of her nanny during late meetings or emergencies. The Asian expansion numbers exceed projections by 22%, Rebecca noted, highlighting figures on her tablet. David's fintech integration is already showing returns. Sydney nodded, satisfied but not surprised. "The board meeting is at 11? "Yes, and you have the Forbes interview at 2. They're sending Annie Leibovitz for the photo shoot." Sydney suppressed a smile. The Forbes feature had been in development for months, a cover story titled "The Architect of Accountability." documenting her transformation of Horizon Partners from a scandal-plagued investment firm to a leader in transparent financial practices. "Remind me to leave by 5, Sydney said, checking her calendar. "It's Sophia's swim class today. I promised I wouldn't miss it again." As Rebecca departed, Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression somber. "The SEC just issued their final ruling on Everett's case." Sydney gestured for him to enter and close the door. "And? 8-figure financial penalties, lifetime ban from the securities industry, 3 years probation. No prison time, as per the agreement." Marcus set the official document on her desk. "It's over, Sydney. Officially over." She ran her fingers over the embossed seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission, feeling a complex mix of emotions. "Have you heard from him?" "His attorney confirms he's liquidating his remaining legitimate assets to pay the penalties. He's still seeing Sophia twice a month." Sydney nodded. "Supervised visits. He's been consistent." She hesitated. "Different." The transformation in Everett had been unexpected. After his capitulation, he had retreated from public view, selling his remaining properties and settling in a modest Connecticut home. His supervised visits with Sophia had begun awkwardly, but gradually evolved into something approaching genuine paternal care. The arrogance that had defined him on Wall Street had diminished, not gone entirely, but tempered by humility that sometimes, in unguarded moments, appeared sincere. "Does Elizabeth know about the ruling?" Sydney asked, referring to their board chair who had been instrumental in the company's rehabilitation. "I called her first thing. She said, and I quote, 'Good. Now perhaps we can all finally move forward.'" Moving forward had become Sydney's mantra over these 18 months. Moving forward with corporate governance reforms that had made Horizon Partners a case study at business schools. Moving forward with innovative investment approaches that prioritized sustainability and ethical returns. Moving forward with her personal life as a single mother, building new traditions with her daughter. "The Tanaka delegation arrives next Tuesday," Sydney noted, changing the subject. "Ensure their accommodations highlight the sustainability initiatives they're interested in, and schedule extra time for the cultural events. Tanaka-san appreciates the relationship-building aspects." "Already arranged." He specifically requested to meet Sophia this time, Marcus added with a small smile. "Apparently he was quite taken with her photos on your desk during his last visit." Sydney returned the smile. "Schedule a dinner at my home then. Sophia can make an appearance before bedtime." After Marcus left, Sydney allowed herself a moment of reflection. The SEC ruling marked the final chapter in the saga that had begun with her decision to expose Everett's fraud. The professional consequences had played out exactly as planned. The personal ones had been more complicated. Her intercom buzzed. "Ms. Montgomery, there's a delivery for you." Moments later, her assistant entered carrying a simple white envelope. Inside was a single sheet of expensive stationery bearing Everett's handwriting. "Sydney, I've been informed of the SEC's final ruling. The end of a chapter for both of us, I suppose. I've enclosed something I thought you should have, a record of my contribution to Sophia's future that I hope demonstrates my commitment to being a father she might someday respect, even if she can never be proud of my past. Everett." Beneath his note was a bank statement showing a trust established in Sophia's name, funded with the majority of Everett's remaining legitimate assets. A substantial sum that would secure their daughter's education and early adult life. He had named Sydney as sole trustee, giving her complete control over the funds. This gesture, relinquishing not just the money but the control it represented, struck Sydney more powerfully than she had expected. It wasn't redemption, but perhaps it was the beginning of something like atonement. She placed the documents in her desk drawer and turned her attention to preparation for the board meeting. No time for sentimentality, not with Horizon Partners on the verge of its most ambitious expansion yet. The Forbes photoshoot took place in Sydney's home, a decision that had initially made her uncomfortable, but that Annie Leibovitz had insisted upon. "I want to capture the whole woman," the legendary photographer had explained, "not just the CEO." Now, as the crew arranged lighting in her living room, Sydney watched Sophia playing with blocks on a blanket, oblivious to the commotion around her. At 21 months, she was a curious, determined child who approached life's challenges with focused intensity that sometimes made Sydney laugh with recognition. "She has your concentration," observed Leibovitz, adjusting her camera, "and perhaps her father's jaw." Sydney raised an eyebrow. "You've done your research. It's a business profile but also a human story," the photographer replied unapologetically. The woman who exposed her husband's financial crimes while carrying his child then rebuilt the company in her own image. It's compelling. It wasn't about revenge, Sydney said reflexively, the clarification she'd made countless times. No, Leibovitz agreed, studying her through the viewfinder. It was about justice. That's what makes it interesting. Revenge is common. Justice is rare. The photo shoot progressed through multiple setups. Sydney at her home office desk, Sydney with Sophia, Sydney standing before the New York skyline visible from her terrace. Throughout, the journalist conducted her interview, exploring the journey from exposed fraud to corporate transformation. Looking back, the journalist asked as they concluded, would you have done anything differently? Sydney considered the question carefully. I would have trusted my instincts sooner, she finally answered. Both professionally and personally. I knew things weren't right long before I acted. That's a regret I carry. And Everett Montgomery? Do you think he deserved a second chance? Second chances aren't about deserving, Sydney replied. They're about capacity for change. The jury's still out on that one. After the Forbes team departed, Sydney sat alone with Sophia, reading her favorite storybook as evening fell. These quiet moments had become sacred, an anchor in her busy life and a reminder of what ultimately mattered most. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. Japanese market responding positively to Tanaka partnership announcement. Stock up 3% already. Good news, but it could wait until morning. Sydney set the phone aside and returned to the story, smiling as Sophia pointed excitedly at the illustrations. The Forbes issue hit newsstands 3 weeks later, featuring Sydney on the cover in a simple black dress, her expression confident but not arrogant, strength emanating from her poised stance against the Manhattan skyline. The headline read, "The Silent Architect, How Sydney Montgomery Rebuilt from Betrayal." The article was more balanced than Sydney had feared, portraying her not as a vengeful wife, but as a strategic leader who had identified systemic problems and addressed them methodically. It detailed the governance reforms she had implemented at Horizon Partners, the emphasis on ethical investment practices, and the company's impressive financial performance under her leadership. Notably, it also acknowledged the personal cost. Montgomery navigates the delicate balance facing many executive mothers, scheduling board meetings around swim classes and taking video calls with international clients after her daughter's bedtime. Balance is a myth, she admits. I prefer to think in terms of presence, being fully present wherever I am, whether that's in the boardroom or building block towers. The article's publication coincided with Horizon Partners' announcement of a major expansion into sustainable technology investments, a move that positioned the firm at the forefront of a rapidly growing sector. The timing was strategic. Sydney had learned from Everett the value of controlling the narrative, though she deployed this skill with transparency rather than manipulation. The morning the magazine appeared, Sydney received an unexpected email from William Spencer, CEO of the Spencer Group and Everett's former Yale roommate. Ms. Montgomery, congratulations on the Forbes feature. Your transformation of Montgomery Financial into Horizon Partners represents exactly the kind of ethical leadership our industry desperately needs. I'd like to discuss potential areas of collaboration between our firms, particularly in the sustainable tech space where we've been making similar inroads. Perhaps lunch next week. Respectfully, William Spencer. Sydney stared at the message, immediately suspicious. Spencer had been Everett's close ally, the intended instrument of his planned return to power. This overture could easily be another attempt at corporate infiltration. She forwarded the email to Marcus with a simple note. Background check. Comprehensive. 3 days later, Marcus delivered his findings in Sydney's office. Spencer has distanced himself from Everett completely, he reported. No communications for at least a year, no financial connections we can trace. His sustainable tech investments appear genuine. They predated our move into the sector. And his company's governance? Clean. Better than industry standard, though not as progressive as our model. Sydney tapped her pen thoughtfully against the desk. Set up the lunch, neutral territory, and I want you there. The meeting with Spencer took place at a discreet restaurant in Midtown, one frequented by financial executives for sensitive discussions. William Spencer proved to be charming and direct, acknowledging the elephant in the room immediately. I imagine you're wondering if I'm here as Everett's proxy, he said, after preliminary pleasantries. I'm not. Our friendship ended when I discovered he had lied to me about the acquisitions he wanted me to pursue, including Montgomery Financial, Sydney noted. Spencer nodded. He presented it as a straightforward opportunity, a good firm dealing with temporary leadership instability. He conveniently omitted the fraud allegations and his plan to use my company as his vehicle back to power. The lunch progressed with discussions of genuine business opportunities, Spencer's expertise in clean energy technology complementing Horizon's innovative investment structures. By the time coffee arrived, Sydney had revised her assessment from suspicious to cautiously optimistic. "One last question," she said, as they prepared to leave. "Have you had any contact with Everett recently?" Spencer hesitated. "I saw him about 2 months ago, not by choice. We both attended the funeral of a mutual friend from Yale." His expression grew somber. "He's changed. Whether that change is genuine or another performance, I couldn't say." Sydney nodded, filing away this observation with others she had collected. The question of Everett's capacity for authentic transformation remained open, complex, and, she had to admit, still personally significant, despite her best efforts to view him clinically. Summer arrived with record heat and new challenges. Horizon Partners' expansion created growing pains that required Sydney's constant attention. Competing firms began poaching talent, necessitating a comprehensive review of compensation and advancement opportunities. The sustainable tech investments showed promise, but demanded intensive monitoring during their early stages. Through it all, Sydney maintained her commitment to balanced presence, restructuring her schedule to preserve her mornings with Sophia before preschool and her early evenings for bath and bedtime rituals. The arrangement wasn't perfect. Emergency calls occasionally interrupted, and international clients sometimes required late-night attention, but it represented a workable compromise between her professional responsibilities and maternal priorities. In late July, as the city sweltered, Sydney received an unexpected call from Elizabeth Winters. "I need to speak with you," the board chair said without preamble. "Tonight, if possible. My home, not the office." "Is everything all right?" Sydney asked, immediately concerned. "It will be," Elizabeth replied cryptically. 8 o'clock? Sydney arrived at the Winters' Upper East Side townhouse precisely on time, still dressed in her office attire, but slightly wilted from the oppressive humidity. Elizabeth greeted her with uncharacteristic tension in her usually composed features. "Thank you for coming," she said, leading Sydney to a private study where Senator Winters was already seated. "James has information you need to hear directly." The senator gestured for Sydney to sit. "What I'm about to share came through confidential channels. Officially, this conversation isn't happening." Sydney nodded her understanding, apprehension building. "A consortium based in Dubai has been quietly acquiring Horizon Partners stock through various fronts for the past 4 months," he continued. "They now control nearly 15%. Not enough for a takeover, but enough to cause significant disruption if they choose." "Who's behind it?" Sydney asked, though she already suspected the answer. "The visible money comes from legitimate UAE investment firms," the senator explained, "but our intelligence suggests they're acting on behalf of a silent partner, someone with intimate knowledge of your company's structure and vulnerabilities." "Everett," Sydney confirmed flatly. "We can't prove it," Elizabeth interjected, "but the pattern matches his typical approach to acquisitions." Sydney processed this information, anger and disappointment warring within her. After all this time, after appearing to accept his fall from grace with something resembling dignity, Everett was orchestrating another attempt to reclaim control. "What's their likely play?" she asked, her strategic mind already analyzing defensive options. "They'll probably accumulate up to 20%, then demand board representation," Senator Winters theorized. "From there, they could block major initiatives, push for leadership changes, or simply create enough internal chaos to depress your stock price before launching a full takeover bid." "Can we block the stock purchases?" The senator shook his head. "Not legally, no, but you can make Horizon less attractive as a target by implementing a poison pill provision." Sydney considered this option. A poison pill would effectively prevent a hostile takeover by making additional stock purchases prohibitively expensive once a threshold was reached. It was a standard defensive measure, but one she had philosophically opposed for its anti-shareholder implications. "That's a last resort," she decided. "First, I want confirmation. If Everett is behind this, I need proof." "My sources are working on it," the senator assured her. But these arrangements are deliberately opaque. Then we'll need to create our own transparency, Sydney said, a plan already forming. Elizabeth, call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. Don't specify the agenda. I don't want this leaking prematurely. The following day, Sydney presented the board with what they knew about the stock accumulation, carefully framing it as a general market threat rather than specifically linking it to Everett without proof. The board authorized preliminary defensive measures, including accelerated implementation of their planned employee ownership program, which would place more stock in friendly hands. After the meeting, Sydney retreated to her office and placed a call she had been avoiding for months. Jackson Hayes, answered the SEC investigator who had been instrumental in the case against Everett. It's Sydney Montgomery, she said. I need to ask about certain provisions of Everett Montgomery's settlement agreement. Hayes sounded surprised. Everything is a matter of public record, Ms. Montgomery. I'm specifically interested in whether acquisition of stock through third parties would constitute a violation of his lifetime ban from the securities industry. A pause. It would depend on the nature of his involvement. Direct orchestration would certainly qualify. Why do you ask? Sydney explained the situation concisely. Hayes' tone shifted from professional courtesy to focused interest. This merits investigation, he acknowledged. I'll need documentation of the purchases and any evidence suggesting Mr. Montgomery's involvement. You'll have everything we have by end of day, Sydney promised. The next week passed in a blur of strategic planning and defensive preparations. Sydney worked late into each night after putting Sophia to bed, analyzing vulnerabilities and developing countermeasures. The weight of potential failure pressed heavily, not just professional failure but personal betrayal. If Everett was indeed orchestrating this attack, it meant every moment of apparent growth during his supervised visits with Sophia had been performance rather than transformation. Then, 10 days after her meeting with the Winters, Sydney received a call from Hayes. We've confirmed unusual financial activity, he reported. Multiple transfers from an account in Connecticut to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, which then funded one of the investment vehicles acquiring your stock. Connecticut, Sydney repeated. Everett's current residence. Yes, and the timing of the transfers correlates perfectly with the stock purchases. The confirmation hit Sydney like a physical blow despite her suspicions. She had allowed herself to believe, however cautiously, that Everett had accepted his new reality, that his focus on being a presence in Sophia's life might represent genuine change. This evidence of continued deception rendered that hope naive. That evening, as Sydney sat in her home office reviewing the latest stock purchase data, her doorman called to announce an unscheduled visitor. Mr. Montgomery is asking to see you, he reported uncomfortably. I explained that he's not on your approved list without prior arrangement, but he's quite insistent. Sydney's first instinct was to refuse, but strategic thinking prevailed. Send him up, please, and call building security to remain on standby. When Everett stepped off the elevator into her foyer, Sydney was struck by how different he appeared from their last meeting. His clothes were still quality but understated, his former polished veneer replaced by a more authentic presence. Only his eyes remained unchanged. Intelligent, calculating, constantly assessing. You know, he said without greeting, noting her crossed arms and defensive stance. The SEC knows too, Sydney replied coldly. Acquiring stock through proxies violates your ban from the securities industry. You're risking criminal charges, Everett. He looked genuinely confused. What are you talking about? What stock? Horizon Partners, the Dubai Consortium, the shell companies and Cayman Islands accounts. Did you think I wouldn't figure it out? Everett's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. Sydney, I have no idea what you're describing. I haven't touched a financial instrument more complicated than a checking account since my settlement. Then explain the transfers from your Connecticut account to Grand Cayman, Sydney challenged, perfectly timed with the stock purchases. My Connecticut? Everett stopped abruptly, understanding dawning. You mean the payments to Caroline's medical team? Sydney faltered. What medical team? Everett ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of genuine distress she recognized from their early years together. My sister, Caroline, she was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer 6 months ago. She's receiving experimental treatment through a clinic that operates out of Grand Cayman for regulatory reasons. The transfers are paying for her treatment. The explanation was so unexpected so far from the financial machinations she had assumed that Sydney momentarily lost her footing in the conversation. "Your sister has cancer?" she asked, recalibrating. "You never mentioned—" "We've hardly been on speaking terms," Everett pointed out, "and my family relationships weren't exactly on the approved topics list for supervised visitation." Sydney studied him, searching for signs of deception. "This is verifiable?" "Completely. Call Mount Sinai right now. Dr. Levinson is her primary oncologist here in the city. The Cayman clinic is called Genesis Therapeutics." He pulled out his phone, scrolling to find information. "I can give you account numbers, doctor names, everything." The sincerity in his voice gave Sydney pause. She had been so certain of his involvement that this alternative explanation seemed almost too convenient. And yet, if not you, then who? She wondered aloud. The pattern is too precise, the targeting too specific to be coincidence. "May I?" Everett gestured toward her laptop. After a moment's hesitation, Sydney turned the screen to show him the data on the stock acquisitions. He studied the information with the focused intensity that had once made him a formidable financial analyst. "These entities," he said, pointing to several names, "they're connected to William Spencer." "Spencer?" Sydney echoed, surprised. "We've been in partnership talks. He approached me directly." "Classic misdirection," Everett noted, continuing to analyze the data. "He establishes a legitimate front relationship while building a position through proxies. I've seen him use this playbook before." The piece clicked into place. Spencer's convenient appearance after the Forbes article, his emphasis on partnership opportunities that would give him inside access to Horizon's operations, his calculated mention of seeing Everett at a funeral to establish apparent distance between them. "You think Spencer is using you to get to me?" Sydney asked, incredulous. "Not to get to you," Everett corrected. "To get what I built. What we built." He looked up from the screen, his expression surprisingly free of bitterness. William always envied Montgomery Financial's success. If he can acquire it now, while disguising his role until it's too late, he'd consider that a win regardless of who's currently in charge. Sydney sank into a chair, reassessing everything in light of this new theory. "I'll need to verify your explanation about Caroline and the medical payments." "Of course," Everett agreed readily. "I'll have Dr. Levinson call you first thing tomorrow." An uncomfortable silence fell between them, the first time they had spoken outside the structured environment of supervised visitation in nearly 2 years. Sydney suddenly became aware of family photos visible on the side table. Sophia at the park, Sophia in her swim class, Sophia laughing in Sydney's arms. Everett's gaze followed hers to the photographs. "She's growing so fast," he said softly. "Every 2 weeks she seems like a different person." Sydney nodded, momentarily united by their shared connection to their daughter. "She asked about you yesterday, wanted to know when Daddy's special time would be." A smile touched Everett's lips, not the calculated expression he had once used to charm investors, but something more genuine. "I've been practicing those songs she likes, the ones with the hand movements." "She'll love that," Sydney acknowledged. Then, refocusing, "If Spencer is behind this, we need to move quickly. The next board meeting is Tuesday, and he's expecting an answer on the partnership proposal." "Set a trap," Everett suggested immediately, the strategic mind that had once built a financial empire engaging with the problem. "Give him what he wants, but structure it to reveal his true intentions." For the next hour they developed a counter-strategy, not as adversaries but as reluctant allies against a common threat. The plan they constructed would use Spencer's own methods against him, creating a false opportunity that would force him to reveal his acquisition strategy prematurely. As they concluded, Everett glanced at his watch. "I should go. It's late." He moved toward the elevator, then paused. "Sydney, regardless of our past, I wouldn't do this, not now, not with Sophia in the middle." Sydney studied him, searching for the familiar signs of manipulation, but finding instead an unfamiliar openness. "I believe you," she said finally, surprising herself with the admission. "About Caroline, at least. The rest we'll verify." After he left, Sydney remained in the foyer, processing the unexpected turn of events. The narrative she had constructed, Everett as the unrepentant manipulator orchestrating one final attack, had been disrupted, forcing her to reconsider assumptions she had held as certainties. As she checked on sleeping Sophia before retiring to her own room, Sydney found herself contemplating the possibility that people, even those who had caused immense harm, might sometimes change in ways that defied easy categorization. The thought was unsettling, yet somehow necessary to her own continuing evolution. Tomorrow would bring verification of Everett's claims about his sister's treatment, strategic planning for the countermove against Spencer, and the usual demanding schedule of leading a major financial firm while raising a toddler. But tonight, in the quiet of her home, Sydney allowed herself to acknowledge that the story she had been telling herself about Everett, about justice, about her own motivations, might be more complex than she had been willing to admit. The realization wasn't comfortable, but it was perhaps the beginning of something necessary. Not forgiveness exactly, but a more nuanced understanding of human capacity for both terrible harm and genuine growth. And in that understanding lay the seeds of a different kind of strength than the one that had carried her through the battles of the past 2 years. As Sydney drifted towards sleep, her mind still working through the implications of the day's revelations, her phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. Check international wire transfers from Spencer's Mauritius account. Follow the money to Jakarta. You'll find what you need there. The message was unsigned, but Sydney knew immediately it was from Everett. The rivalry that had defined their relationship was transforming into something unexpected, a reluctant alliance against a new threat. And within that transformation lay the potential for a final, surprising twist in the story neither of them could have anticipated. The Manhattan skyline glowed golden in the late afternoon light as Sydney Montgomery stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Horizon Partners executive suite. At 45, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who had faced her battles and emerged not just victorious but transformed. Silver threads now wove elegantly through her auburn hair, subtle markers of the years that had passed since those tumultuous days when she had reclaimed her destiny. "Mum, are you daydreaming again?" Sydney turned to find Sophia standing in the doorway, her school backpack slung casually over one shoulder. At 13, she was already showing signs of the woman she would become, tall for her age, with Everett's piercing dark eyes and Sydney's determined chin. "Not daydreaming," Sydney corrected with a smile. "Reflecting. There's a difference." "On what?" Sophia dropped into the visitor's chair with teenage nonchalance. Sydney gestured toward the desk where a framed magazine cover stood, the Forbes issue from nearly 12 years earlier, now a relic of another life. History, choices, consequences. Sophia rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "Dad says you get philosophical before board meetings." "Does he now?" Sydney raised an eyebrow, amused rather than irritated by the observation. "And what else does your father say about me?" "That you're the smartest person he's ever known," Sophia replied matter-of-factly, "and that watching you build Horizon Partners taught him more than Harvard and Yale combined." Sydney absorbed this with quiet surprise. Such acknowledgments from Everett were rare, especially to their daughter, who had been carefully shielded from the worst details of their past conflict. The journey from adversaries to functional co-parents had been neither quick nor easy. After the Spencer incident, which had ended with William Spencer facing federal charges for securities manipulation and attempted corporate espionage, Everett had gradually proven himself worthy of increased time with Sophia. The supervised visits had given way to occasional unsupervised afternoons, then weekends, eventually settling into a structured co-parenting arrangement that prioritized Sophia's well-being above lingering resentments. Everett had rebuilt his life not in finance, but, surprisingly, in education. After his sister Caroline's successful cancer treatment, the medical payments that had initially raised Sydney's suspicions, he had founded a non-profit focused on financial literacy for underprivileged youth. The program had grown into a nationally recognized model, providing inner-city students with practical knowledge about money management, entrepreneurship, and ethical business practices. "Your speech starts in 40 minutes, Sophia reminded her, checking the sleek watch she'd received for her last birthday, a gift from both parents, selected together in one of their rare moments of perfect alignment. "Dad's already downstairs with Grandma Elizabeth." Sydney nodded, gathering her notes for the evening's event. The 10th anniversary celebration of the Horizon Foundation, the philanthropic arm of Horizon Partners that had become her most personal achievement. Under her leadership, the company had not only flourished financially, but had reinvented corporate responsibility in the financial sector, setting standards that competitors now raced to emulate. "How do I look?" Sydney asked, smoothing her tailored navy dress. Sophia tilted her head critically, like the most powerful woman in finance, but maybe a little more lipstick. Sydney laughed, reaching for her purse. "When did you become such an image consultant?" "Someone has to look after you," Sophia replied with the mixture of adolescent sassiness and genuine concern that characterized their relationship. "Dad says you'd work 24 hours a day if no one stopped you." "Your father should talk," Sydney murmured, applying the suggested lipstick. "I've seen his calendar." They took the private elevator down to the event space, where hundreds of guests were gathering to celebrate the Foundation's decade of impact. As they stepped into the reception area, Sydney immediately spotted Everett in conversation with Elizabeth Winters, now in her 70s but still commanding respect with her elegant presence. For a moment, Sydney observed him unnoticed. At 55, Everett Montgomery retained the charismatic presence that had once dominated Wall Street, though it now served different purposes. The arrogance had mellowed into confidence, tempered by humility. His expensive suits had given way to more modest attire that reflected his current work rather than his former status. Sophia waved, catching his attention. He excused himself from Elizabeth and approached them, his smile genuine as he greeted his daughter with a quick hug. "You look nice," he said to Sydney, the compliment simple but sincere. "Thanks," she replied. "Sophia thinks I need more lipstick." "Sophia thinks everyone needs more lipstick," he countered with a knowing look at their daughter, who shrugged unapologetically. "The governor just arrived," Everett informed them, shifting to business, "and the Times reporter wants 5 minutes before you speak." Sydney nodded, grateful for his practical focus. Their ability to function as a team in Sophia's presence had become one of their greatest achievements, a testament to growth neither had thought possible in the aftermath of their conflict. "I need to find Rebecca," Sydney said. "Sophia, stay with your father." "Actually," Everett interjected, "I thought she might want to come meet Dr. Williams from Columbia. She's the one who developed that engineering program Sophia's interested in." Sophia's eyes lit up. "Really? She's here?" Sydney watched them go, struck by how naturally Everett had shifted into supporting their daughter's interests and ambitions, so different from the man who had once dismissed Sydney's own contributions with casual arrogance. The evening progressed smoothly, culminating in Sydney's address to the assembled guests. Standing at the podium, she surveyed the room filled with business leaders, non-profit partners, educators, and beneficiaries of the Foundation's programs. 10 years ago, she began, Horizon Partners made a commitment not just to ethical financial practices, but to positive social impact. We recognized that true success isn't measured quarterly, but generationally, not by market cap, but by lives improved. As she spoke about the Foundation's achievements, educational initiatives, community development projects, environmental sustainability programs, Sydney found herself making unplanned eye contact with Everett, who stood at the back of the room with Sophia beside him. Something unspoken passed between them, acknowledgement perhaps of how far they had come from those days of betrayal and retribution. After the speech, as guests mingled and networked, Sydney found herself momentarily alone on the terrace overlooking the city. The spring air carried the promise of renewal, a fitting metaphor for the evening's celebrations. "Impressive speech," came Everett's voice as he joined her at the railing. "The Foundation has become something extraordinary." "Thank you," she said simply. "Your educational programs have been instrumental partners." He nodded, accepting the professional acknowledgement. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the city lights emerge as dusk deepened. "I never thanked you properly," Everett said suddenly. Sydney turned to him, puzzled. "For what?" "For not destroying me completely when you had the chance." His gaze remained on the horizon. "You could have. You had every right to, but you left room for—" "Redemption," Sydney supplied when he trailed off. "Transformation," he corrected. "I don't know if redemption is possible after certain mistakes, but transformation is." He finally looked at her directly. "What you did, exposing the fraud, demanding accountability, it was necessary. Painful, but necessary." The admission hung in the air between them, more meaningful for its rarity. In 13 years, they had never directly discussed the events that had shattered their marriage and reshaped their lives. "Sophia asked me yesterday about why we divorced," Everett continued. "She's at that age, connecting dots, asking difficult questions." Sydney tensed. "What did you tell her?" "The truth, that I made terrible mistakes, both professionally and personally." that I betrayed not just our clients, but you, that the consequences were justified. Sydney absorbed this with surprise. They had agreed years ago on an age-appropriate narrative for Sophia that emphasized incompatibility rather than betrayal, protecting her from the harsher realities until she was older. She deserves honesty, Everett added, seeing Sydney's expression. Not every detail, but the fundamental truth. I won't have her believing a sanitized version that might lead her to repeat my mistakes. The statement revealed a depth of self-awareness that the old Everett had never possessed. Sydney found herself nodding slowly in agreement. She also asked if I ever regretted losing you. He continued, his voice quieter. I told her that was the wrong question. Oh, Sydney raised an eyebrow. What's the right question? Whether I'm grateful for what came after, and I am. His expression was unguarded, perhaps for the first time in their long history. Not just for the time with Sophia, but for the person I've become because of the fall. I needed to lose everything to find something worth having. The simple sincerity of his words touched something in Sydney that she had long thought dormant. Not love, certainly, but understanding. Recognition of a shared journey through different landscapes. I should find Sophia, Sydney said after a moment. It's getting late. Everett nodded, the moment passing naturally. She mentioned the science exhibition this weekend. I know it's technically my weekend, but I thought maybe we could both go. She'd like that. I'd like that too, Sydney agreed, surprising herself with the realization that it was true. As they returned to the reception, Sydney caught sight of Sophia deep in conversation with Rebecca's teenage son, her animated gestures reflecting her father's enthusiasm, her thoughtful pauses echoing Sydney's own deliberative style. In their daughter, the best of both of them lived on, untainted by past conflicts. Later that night, after the event concluded and Sophia had gone home with Everett for his scheduled weekend, Sydney stood once more at the windows of her Upper West Side apartment. The city sprawled before her, a tapestry of lights and shadows, much like the journey that had brought her to this moment. On her desk lay the final draft of her memoir, completed after years of careful writing. The Silent Architect would be published next month, telling her story in her own words for the first time. Not a tale of revenge or vindication, but of accountability, transformation, and the complex path to authentic power. The last paragraph read, "There is no perfect justice in an imperfect world. There is only the choice to build rather than destroy, to transform rather than condemn, to move forward rather than remain captive to the past." In architecture, whether of buildings or lives or companies, the true test is not how quickly we construct, but how meaningfully we endure. Sydney closed the manuscript, at peace with its impending release into the world. The woman who had once meticulously planned the exposure of her husband's fraud had become someone different, not softer, but wiser, not less determined, but more compassionate in her determination. The phone on her desk lit up with a text from Sophia. "Dad says to remind you about lunch tomorrow to plan the summer program. P.S. I think he's nervous about your book." Sydney smiled, typing back, "Tell him the villain always gets the most interesting chapters." A moment later, a response. He laughed and said that's what he's afraid of. In that simple exchange lay the most unexpected outcome of all, not the professional success or public vindication, but the hard-won peace that allowed two people who had once inflicted profound pain upon each other to find a way forward for the sake of something more important than either of their egos. As Sydney turned from the window, she caught her reflection. A woman who had architected not just a company or a career, but a life of integrity and purpose. The journey hadn't followed the blueprint she'd once imagined, but the resulting structure was stronger for its unexpected turns, its careful renovations, its deliberate preservation of what was worth saving, alongside the courage to demolish what was not. And in that reflection was the final truth, that the most challenging architecture of all is not of buildings or businesses, but of the human heart, with its capacity for both terrible harm and remarkable healing, for betrayal and forgiveness, for falling and, against all odds, rising again. If this story touched your heart, and you want to keep following inspiring and moving stories, be sure to check out our upcoming videos. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to stay updated on new content that can brighten your journey and provide valuable insights. Join us and keep exploring stories that truly matter. I'm sure the next video that pops up on your screen will touch you as well, so click on it now and we'll see you there.